Hello, everyone. So I've got 30 minutes, and there's people who are walking in, but this is going to be shifting a little bit. Some of the slides may not exactly align with what I was originally intending, but based on who I've been speaking with, it's going to adapt. So this is me. I have been in the finance industry for about 10 years. Started off as a QSA, quickly started assessing payment applications. From there, began doing pen testing, application testing, ended up doing forensics for a couple of years, and now I lead the point-to-point encryption and PIN service lines for Shellman. Most of my focus is on training and educating clients on what they need to do if they're going to pursue those payment paths. So ultimately, when we think about the security of transactions in the finance industry, it's about trust. Every relationship you have is going to be based on trust. This is where you don't have to invest your time into something because you understand that it's going to be done securely. Where we begin to see issues are where hackers can impact that trust. So initially, we think about a common business transaction or finance transaction. It's bank, credit union bank, Bitcoin, or crypto. These transactions are relatively simple and are often the most secure, but also the most profitable for hackers to compromise. Then you've got, a merchant gateway bank. Every merchant has a relationship with their own bank. This is where all the transactions go through, and then it gets sent off to the bank of the person who's going to pay them and comes back. For these business models, most of the time the merchant is the point of compromise. Gateways, if compromised, are going to impact many more because they service a larger number of merchants. Pretty simple so far. And please pardon me if I'm flying through because I definitely have Q&A, and I definitely want to talk about some of the issues relevant to what I've heard this morning. Last, the cardholder, merchant bank. Cardholder, this is the person who's handing their information over. You could swap out cardholder here for anybody who's entering in PII. You could put in, anybody who's filling out a mortgage application. Regardless of this involvement, the person providing that information to the merchant or intermediary is trusting that this is going to be done securely and it's going to be handled appropriately to the level of information you're handing, right? So if you're handing over a social, it's more secure than if you're handing over a telephone number or an email address. So, social engineering is a manipulation of that trust. We see ourselves in others. We want to trust. A lot of these manipulate that trust. You've got somebody who's working in marketing. They want to click that link to see the products that they're being sold. You have people who are going to contact you, vishing, impersonating somebody. So maybe you're the person who performs accounts payable goes on vacation, and all of a sudden you get an email from them. And then that's followed up by a phone call to the customer that's supposed to be paid. These kinds of multifaceted attacks do exist. We do see them, and they are really effective when you think about the amount of money that can be transferred in a moment's notice because people are manipulated into thinking, oh, I forgot to pay that one thing right before I went on vacation. Next is ransomware. Easily one of the bigger buzzwords in the cybersecurity space right now. At its root, ransomware is the attacker's ability to deny your access to your systems. It's going to encrypt it. And then by paying a ransom, you get those systems back. Seems fairly simple. People don't often recognize that ransomware, they're already in your environment. They've gone through, they've been able to encrypt those systems so they had access to the data that those systems held. As you can imagine, they're going to want to exfiltrate that data. They're going to want to look at that data. Is it valuable? And it's not like after you pay that ransom, they can't come back. It's not like, whoa, that person paid a ransom a month ago. Let's leave them alone. Right? That doesn't exist. So payment acceptance, you could, again, instead of just applying this to payments, this is any sort of information that you're providing. Mobile phones are the computers in our pocket, right? Tablets, we use these things everywhere. So when we consider the amount of data that is being entered into these devices, you can imagine how a corrupt APK application you download from Google Play, fill in the blank, is going to potentially compromise the security of that data. Similarly, a lot of people don't recognize that every time you install that app, right? Why does a calculator need my contacts, right? Like, these things exist because they want your information. They profit off of that data. So when you provide anything or post anything, or rather, when you install anything on your phone or tablet, you have a security concern that you may not be thinking about. Again, this erodes trust. So advanced persistent threats, probably the most detailed part of this element of my presentation. An attacker gains access to your environment. What do? They're going to want to know what's there, and they're going to want to make sure that they stay there. So when we just looking at what we call dwell time, how long a vulnerability, or rather how long an attack is present on your network before you detect it, 45 days last year. 45 days. It's over a month. So an attacker has access to your environment. They're moving around, looking at information, and they're going to use that malware to pull down more malware. They're going to keep on building their attacker toolbox, and then they're going to see what's valuable and what's not. Advanced persistent threats leverage the things that you may not be anticipating, so that if you eradicate the known malware, maybe something kicks off a month later, 2 months later. And these kinds of attacks are, obviously problematic because they're going to recur. And there's the ability to prevent them is very difficult. And often the organizations that are doing this are well funded. Think organized crime, nation states, artificial intelligence. Everybody here has, artificial intelligence, greatest thing ever. So it is. It's how we are going to be able to make sense of information that we ourselves cannot readily understand. But just like any other tool, artificial intelligence can be used to scan code, perform heuristics on passwords. In other words, I know that you could have special characters throughout this, but more likely than not, you're going to start off with a capital letter because it's what you're a habit of. So these kinds of heuristics or patterns that we have are all over the place. And attackers take, and so does AI, huge password dumps where you get millions of passwords, and they're like, what is the most likely first letter? Why is the exclamation point the special character that everyone seems to choose? And why is it that if I end with the number 1, the chances are pretty high that the next one's going to end with the number 2 when I'm forced to rotate it? You might be guilty of this. Maybe you're not. I mean, it's hard to say. But it's easy for people to do. So third-party service providers, a heavily overlooked attack vector. Pretty much every organization today utilizes a third-party service provider for some sort of function, be it hosting, be it managing a firewall. Maybe you rely upon a third-party service provider to write your code. Regardless of these functions, understanding what third-party service providers have access to in your environment gives you an idea of what would happen if that provider was compromised. What we in the forensics industry consider a one-to-many, one service provider who has remote access to 15 clients means that potentially that service provider, when compromised, would then compromise 15 customers. Going back a couple slides to the advanced persistent threats, I was in a forensic investigation with a bank. A developer, really smart guy, I interviewed this guy, was asked to interview for a position. He was seeing something on LinkedIn. He looked up the company, went to their website. It looked legit. He went around, looked at the people who were shown on the pictures. They had histories. He went to their LinkedIn pages. He started exchanging emails with them. Then he interviewed on the phone. Then he interviewed via a Zoom call. So this person is like, this is a real company. Fills out the application. The company responds and says, hey, would you fill it out on an R form instead? And they've got this PDF. PDF prompts this developer to run an executable. Developer's like, yeah, I know I shouldn't, but I really want this job. So the developer runs the executable. Executable installs malware on the laptop. Developer goes back to work. Now that developer laptop is the point of entry to the bank. That access right there compromised what was way too much of a flat network, but cost that bank tens of millions of dollars to identify and correct, in addition to the fact that that bank had access to a number of its partners, again, third-party service provider. So even the most educated of us can be susceptible to these things. It's not like that person was trying to do something wrong. And he was the one who, after the fact, was like, that could have been me. But it's pretty easy to see how the chain of events from one small event can lead to a very severe financially compromised situation. So this little chart here discusses how the cost of $1 of fraud, what it means to the merchants. So when you think, oh, well, that person stole $1, it's $1 to fix. Well, that's not true, because you have to think about the time that people took in to correct the issue, the number of communications you have to go to, merchants who have to pay out when they were deemed responsible for that breach. So for these kinds of issues, $1 of fraud now costs $3.60. This is from LexisNexis. This chart, or rather these details here kind of highlight in scope. So phishing is now the second main attack vector. 70% of breaches begin with a phishing attack. When you look at these other ones, ransomware costs an average of $4.62 million. That's not what they paid. That's what it took for them to either rebuild systems, reinstall clean backups, fill in the blank. That is a crazy high number. Unless you've got $4.62 million hanging out someplace, and you're probably not going to be hanging out and talking to me if you do, that's a pretty serious number. SIM swap scams, going back to the cell phone conversation earlier, cell phones have a SIM. This is who I am, and this is how cell phone towers know how to get my phone number and how I reach out. I identify by this. Think of it as a specific address for your phone. SIM swapping means that somebody is going to get a SIM, emulate yours, and impersonate you. So offhand, you're like, wow, that's kind of weird. Why would they want to answer calls from my mom? That's not the point. What they really want to do is get to the information that you have access to. So they can look at, maybe I know that you have a bank account with X Bank, and if I call from this number, I'm more likely to get information. Or you can say, when you kick off a password request and they call you, well, now they're calling your attacker. Or multi-factor authentication. There's all kinds of MFA out there, and sometimes you can have them prompt you by calling your phone with a number. Well, if I compromised your laptop, now I have an aim to compromise your SIM, and I'm going to be able to gain access to that. Now I've got remote access to your network. Not so good. FBI made a report that there was $68 million lost on that last year. It's a pretty high number for an attack that a lot of people probably don't consider. And then the last one, we talked about third-party service providers. 53% of companies said, hey, this has happened to us. Maybe not in the last year, but it's happened to them. So if none of you are considering who your third-party service providers are, or who they are, what they have access to, I hope those gears are kicking in. And by the way, this is all doom and gloom. We're going to bring it back a little bit. So, considerations. We're going to start with kind of setting the stage and where you begin. You have to know what data you have. You have to know the value of that data. You have to know how you're handling that data, where it's coming, where it's going. As you can imagine, this is no easy effort, and there are companies that specialize in this exact issue, because you go to a bank and you say, hey, what's your data? And they're like, you usually get that face. Maybe they don't make that face openly, but they're definitely making it in their head because they don't know. In addition to just having credit card data, they've got Social Security. They've got everything that you could do to impersonate or compromise all of their customers or other business relationships. That's crazy. So we need to think about how these exchanges are performed. Went too far. Understanding how the data is in your environment, now how do we communicate that with partners? How are we protecting that in transit? When we think about the scalability of solutions, your boss comes to you and says, I need you to implement X. You're like, on it, implementing X. You do X, and you're like, hey, this is working pretty well. Does it scale? Maybe it works for 10 customers. Does it work for 100? Maybe this problem solves one issue, but then down the road is going to introduce 10. So having forward thinking or being flexible is really the core of this, not being tied to a solution because sunk costs. Just because you've put a lot of time and sweat equity into something doesn't mean it's going to be the thing you need next year. On this same note, companies will acquire other institutions. Say, hey, I really like that guy's environment, what it does, the way it handles, fill in the blank, it doesn't matter. If you acquire a company, you don't just acquire the goods, you acquire everything. When you attach that network to yours, if that network had a compromise, you just pulled it right on into your environment. And I don't know how many of you have worked through an acquisition, but very few companies take the time to perform risk analysis on the IT of the company that they just acquired, which, as you can imagine, is not really a good idea. Cost analysis, considering the risk of an attack. This is not just, oh, they stole X amount of dollars and I'm going to get sued for it, or I got cyber insurance, we're good, and they give some finger guns. Finger guns don't solve this problem. The cost of an attack is going to be the hours that your team spends fixing the issue. It's going to be the amount of time that you're spending on calls with your customers, trying to soothe their fears because they've eroded that trust, where you're handling our data. Are you handling it securely? How are you protecting this? And now that you have this issue, how are you going to earn our trust back? This is an untenable situation that no organization wants to be in. And when we think about the cost analysis of implementing a solution today, well, maybe it's a lot more palatable, despite the fact that the number might be higher than you were wanting to pay. So these controls, anybody who's been in IT is going to be like, yeah, Sully, I got it. But hardening is when you install a default operating system, these things aren't secure. There's all kinds of default values that need to change because these can be compromised. These are known. This isn't like some mystery here. And nothing that I'm saying here is a mystery. So you need to harden these systems, and you need to do it consistently. If you have 5 systems in your network, sure, maybe you've got 5 different hardening standards. I really don't care. But if you have 100, well, how do I know that this was consistently applied across the environment? Because if one of those systems is compromised, and you said it's because this wasn't done, now I know that it applies everywhere else. And if you think to yourself, okay, now I need to update these configurations, I know that I need to do it consistently. And then it's repeatable. It's a process you build in. And this is where the value of immutable deployment, cloud computing, nodes, fill in the blank, are of value to companies. And by the way, maybe the people in here don't think about the word immutable. Immutable means unrefutable. Like, I'm not going to be able to say that that doesn't exist. So immutable deployment means that I have a known good, I throw it out there, and it's going to operate in production. Maybe it's a web server, maybe it's a database server. But when I need to have a new one go out, I'm just going to take the whole image, it's updated, it's patched, new code, throw it out there. And I'm just going to get rid of the old one. I mean, it's a beautiful time to be alive when you can throw away a system so easily and deploy something that you have far more assurance is secure. Verification. This is something that comes up a lot. We talk about things like KYC, and we're going to be able to verify who you are, who you say you are. And that is the core of a lot of issues. You can say that I am me. I know I'm me. This is my phone. But if someone's emulating your phone, how does the other person know? Multi-factor authentication helps break this, where you have different factors, something you are, something you have, or something you know, and you combine 2 of those 3 to say, I am who I say I am. And that does a lot. It's not perfect, but it's way better than single factor. Mutual authentication is a way for 2 organizations to send data to say, I know who you are, do you know who I am? And you're going to trust each other on that channel. That is far more secure than most operations occur today, and it's not that difficult to set up. It just takes some time. Three domain secure, not a lot of people know about this one, but this is primarily focused on payments, but it's a way for people making card not present transactions, think mobile, e-commerce, to verify who you say you are with your bank. And in these, a person is, on a website, they want to make a credit card transaction. They put something, it doesn't matter what they're buying. They send that off to the payment gateway. Payment gateway says, whoa, do we know who this person is? And maybe they use the metadata of the browser. Maybe there's other information present on your system which is going to establish who you are. But if not, when it routes to your bank says, hey, ask this question. Comes back to you. Maybe it's a PIN, maybe it is an actual answer, but then that process is through just like a PIN, except your PIN is given up front when you go to an ATM. And all these controls need to be established and tested, because a PIN, if you go to an ATM, who has seen the hardware that snaps on top of an ATM that captures your PIN? Anybody see that? It's pretty crazy, right? It looks just like an ATM, but it's capturing not only your card, but your PIN. Think about that. So we need to protect this PIN. And there are a whole suite of security standards around them. This is kind of my wheelhouse. Next, encryption. If you learn anything about encryption from me in this little bit, it's this. It does not matter how strong your encryption is. If they get the key, it's useless. Let's make this like a giant vault. You walk into a bank and you see this giant vault with this big door. You're like, no one's getting through that door. Well, if you had the code posted right in front, kind of renders that big door useless. So let's think about how we're protecting the keys that perform these transactions. VPNs. This is a dedicated link between two endpoints, and you're thinking, that's pretty cool. I hear a lot about it. People are always trying to sell me VPNs. Well, VPNs can also be established with a password. That password is sometimes written in clear text to a file. Think about that. All right, so that means if one of those endpoints gets compromised, well, can I connect to that VPN from this other system? What information's on that system? What am I going to exchange? What does it read? And then suddenly your mind starts to spiral. What are you going to do about it? So we're going to kind of wrap it up here before we go so quickly to some Q&A. What can you do? You can take time to identify the data you have. You could take time to understand the controls of these controls of that data based on the sensitivity of it. And you can test. You don't have to be a whiz to get these things done. A lot of the language frameworks that build, or rather upon which your applications are built, have tools built into them to test. And you can do static and dynamic analysis for those who don't do this kind of thing. If I look at code, right, I can say, oh, that's written poorly, that needs to be fixed. If I think about dynamic, it's interacting with it. So you have a form field. What happens if I throw a bunch of garbage characters in there? What happens? Are my tests doing this so that, because attackers are doing it, and they're not doing it in person, they're using machines. The same machines you want to use to protect your tools are the similar machines that they're going to use to break it. Penetration testing is where you have somebody it's basically a fancy name for like a hacker, but you're paying them, they're good, and they're going to identify shortcomings. Penetration testers specialize in certain fields. So when you do engage them to test your network, test your systems, your database, your cloud environment, make sure you inquire on that, but then they're going to give you a report, and that report's going to say, this is how I broke your data or your system. This is how I got your data. This is how you can fix it. It's proactive. And the last one, security controls. Every one of the security controls that I talk about here, most of your environments are already detecting. Are they reviewed? Who's reviewing them? And test it. Talk to your IT admin and say, hey, throw a bunch of garbage passwords in here. See what happens. Hey, try to connect to this VPN. See what happens. These kinds of tests can verify the efficacy of each of your controls, and if you don't get an alert, well, now you can start fixing it. And it takes time. This is not easy. If you have any questions about this after the fact, I'm about to go to Q&A here. If you have any questions about this, security should not be a mystery, and I am inviting all of you to contact me for any kind of cybersecurity question, because if I can't answer it, I likely know somebody who does, and nobody should be left without someone to contact for those questions. So Q&A. Anybody got a question? Yeah, have at it.
So one of the things that I've learned, somebody had told me, was a safety feature they were going to use is to delete emails after 1 year. Have you ever heard that?
Absolutely. So emails can contain all kinds of data that you don't necessarily hold value. Maybe you're just writing your colleague to say, hey, are you going to be at this meeting in 2 hours? But there's also additional information that can be found in there. These are attachments. Maybe those attachments have details about business ventures you were engaging in. When we think about data as a whole, data is, let's put it this way. You don't know necessarily a year ago what was in your emails. And so by deleting them, you remove that option from an attacker being able to exploit it. Good question. Two great questions. First one, there's usually similarities between breaches. The common things that compromise an environment are misconfigurations. That's number one. Phishing is number two. Phishing has absolutely nothing to do with the controls you have on your web page, but access controls, network segmentation, micro-segmentation, based on the way your environment is built, you can absolutely institute controls so that if a person is compromised by phishing, they don't get access to the goods. When you're dealing with companies like Chase, that's a data issue. What data do you have and who has access to it? In almost every forensic case I've ever worked on, people had too much access. And at that point, in terms of the cat and mouse issue, you're not going to get rid of that. There is no control that we're going to talk about here. And I mean, people can talk up here and be like, Bitcoin's the most secure thing ever. It's not. We obviously see issues happening, and they're going to happen because there's money in it. And if there's money in it, people are going to go after it. So this is where it's being proactive, being engaging, and then saying, okay, this is what I learned about this attack. Does it apply to my environment? That lessons learned about your industry partners or your industry competitors even is where you cannot be as susceptible to those problems. Very good question. Did I answer it, by the way? Excellent.
It's actually working now. Okay. So I'm running a fairly small company, really limited IT budget. Can you speak to kind of the, just high-level choices in terms of hosting, where your data is? We have ours on AWS. Should I feel secure and safe with that, or are there certain things that I've got to do, Obviously, on our portal side, we've got two-factor authentication and PINs and so forth, but I'm just wondering, am I maybe too comfortable, or are there things I have to do, or is this a question of private versus public, cloud and so forth? I'm just wondering your thoughts on that. So
offhand, every cloud service provider, they make money off of trust, going back to what I was talking about before. And they want you to trust that their systems are inherently secure. There are a number of built-in controls to any cloud provider that they can do an automated assessment of your environment. Usually you've got to pay for them, obviously, because they want to make money where they can. And I'm out of time. Can I keep going or no? Yeah, but you can check into those controls. It's hard for small business owners. There's no doubt about it, because I'm standing up here acting like everybody here is a security professional like I am. And that's not real. It's not realistic. So ask me questions, and we'll talk more later, I hope. But implement the controls that are native to whatever platform you're using, and be mindful of the data you have. And if you're not sure, ask somebody, because chances are there's controls built into the technologies you use that can help prevent you from being a victim. Thank you everyone for the time. I hope to hear lots of questions from you later.